Welcome to Season 2 of my podcast. You are listening to The Things Nobody Tells You About with Martha Cherubin. This podcast is about the unspoken things in pregnancy, labor, and postnatal that nobody tells prospective mothers, parents, and or childbearing age women about. In today's episode, we are going to talk about the first part of my postnatal story, specifically the first 72 hours after I gave birth to my son. When I gave birth to my son, my husband and my doula were in the room. My husband was sitting next to me, holding my hands, while the doula kept an eye on what was going on during the C-section. She also took a bunch of photos of us and the baby, which I truly appreciated. Cesarian delivery or C-section is a surgical procedure used to deliver a baby through incisions in the abdomen and uterus. During my C-section, I started to have something they call the shakes. It's when your body, specifically your upper body, is starting to spasm uncontrollably during a cesarean delivery. I also felt really cold, which kind of freaked me out a little bit because nobody told me about those side effects. I later learned that it's a common reaction to the spinal block that they give you before you have a C-section. It supposedly goes away after the anesthesia wears off. Most C-sections are done under regional anesthesia, which is what I had. It numbs only the lower part of your body. Regional anesthesia allows you to remain awake during the procedure. Common choices include spinal block and epidural block. In an emergency, general anesthesia is sometimes needed. With general anesthesia, you won't be able to see, feel, or hear anything during the birth. So, during my C-section, although the lower part of my body was numb, I could still feel the pushing and the tugging sensation as the doctor was taking the baby out of my belly. After they took my son out, they brought him over for my husband and I to see him. We held him just for a little bit before they took him away. Since I was still on the operation table, I got a little bit paranoid because of the stories that I've heard about hospitals switching babies or people stealing babies. So I made sure that my husband followed our baby everywhere they took him. I told him, do not let him out of your sight. Make sure that you stay with him no matter what. I also told my husband to remind them to follow my birth plan, which specified how many vaccines I would like them to administer to my baby while he is at the hospital. I wanted him to get the rest of the vaccines at the pediatrician's office instead. From talking to my doula and the pediatrician that I had already selected for my son, I knew that my baby did not necessarily need to take all of the vaccines at once at the hospital. So I knew I had choices, and I made sure that I told my OBGYN and the hospital staff what they were. Since the lower part of my body was numb due to the anesthesia, they had also inserted temporarily a urinary catheter in me, which nobody told me about. I was actually a little bit surprised that they inserted a catheter temporarily after a C-section. A urinary catheter is a flexible tube inserted through a narrow opening into a body cavity to drain and remove fluid from the bladder. After my OBGYN closed my incisions, they took me back to the recovery room where my husband and baby were waiting, along with two of the nurses. They handed me the baby, and he latched on and started breastfeeding within 30 seconds. I was pleasantly surprised and grateful for my doula, who had been preparing me and showing me how to effectively breastfeed before I gave birth to the baby. She taught me almost everything that I needed to know about breastfeeding, and even the lactation specialist at the hospital was impressed. I stayed in the recovery room for about an hour or so. Then they took me to the postnatal care unit on the maternity floor. Shortly after I arrived, they put a device on my legs. It looked like one of those things you find at a massage place or a nail salon that inflates and deflates. They said that since I was laying still for a while during the C-section, the device will help improve circulation and prevent blood clots. The device stayed on most of the time I was at the hospital, except for when I needed to walk around, which they strongly encouraged. The more you move after a major surgery like a C-section, the better it is for you. Moving will help get your bowels working again and prevent a lot of gas pains and blood clots. A CNA would come, I think, the first 2 days to give me a post-operation vaginal wash. I was a little bit surprised by this because nobody told me about it being part of the process. Post-operation vaginal wash is a post-delivery peri-bottle rinse and dry cloth pat down to clean any blood leaking after the surgery. She would also give me a sponge bath in bed because I'm not supposed to take a shower the first 24 hours after a C-section to prevent the incision from getting wet and getting infected. I found out that although I had a C-section, I was having vaginal bleeding. So they had to give me sanitary pads to wear. Sanitary pads are rectangles of absorbent material that attach to the inside of a female's underwear to catch menstrual blood. From what I understand, the bleeding is a way of the uterus to clean itself after delivery, which they told me was normal. The uterine wall is healing itself after the placenta has detached, so your blood vessels are responding to hormonal fluctuations. That thick lining that grew to support the baby throughout your pregnancy is shedding. And the bleeding normally is supposed to last about 6 weeks. I also found out that having a C-section will make you extremely gassy. And they had to give me gas relief tablets to get rid of the bloating and the feelings of pressure and discomfort in my stomach. Once the anesthesia started to wear off, I became very itchy, especially my legs. They told me that's also a side effect of the medication. The postnatal care unit at the hospital was simply phenomenal. Each patient has their own private room with a pull-out bed so that your spouse, your partner, friend, or family member can stay with you in the room if you want them to. The food was also quite good, which was a very, very pleasant surprise. It really felt like I was eating at a restaurant. It was that good. And the nurse's assistant, they were just simply amazing. I would call them multiple times throughout the night if I had a question or I needed help. My night nurse would respond right away and be in the room within minutes. I can't say enough about how great the nurses, the CNAs, the food, and just the whole unit were at that hospital. For a first time mom who was scared, overwhelmed, traumatized, and concerned about what it means being a Black woman giving birth at a hospital, that postnatal care unit and the whole maternity floor made me feel welcome and at ease. So I am very grateful for that. They took such great care of me that when it was time for me to leave, I didn't really want to go. I was like, no, I don't want to go. Can I stay here or can you come home with me? My doctors were ready to discharge me on day 3, but I asked them if I can stay an extra day because I was a little scared to go home with a newborn. I loved all the support I was getting from the staff, and I felt like I needed one more day to mentally prepare myself for what's to come. Although I had a very positive experience at the postnatal care unit, I didn't or couldn't sleep at all. I was obsessively staring at the baby to make sure that he was breathing properly, even though he was perfectly healthy. He did not have any breathing problems, and my husband was right there with me the whole time, sleeping on the pull-out couch next to the hospital bed. I was afraid to fall asleep because what if something happens to him in the middle of the night and I wasn't awake to help him? I was still in shock and traumatized by the whole experience, and I just couldn't believe what just happened. Did I just give birth to a baby? A whole baby? Is this for real? Ironically, I also needed somebody to watch over me as well. The third night, when I was finally able to close my eyes for a few minutes and get some sleep, I almost choked to death. If my husband wasn't in the room, I probably would. I dozed off for a few minutes after I breastfed the baby and put him back on his little bassinet next to my bed. Somehow, in the middle of my sleep, I started choking on my saliva. I could not sit up to catch my breath, reach the handrails, or ring the call bell. The baby started wailing, and my husband just sprung up into action. He just put his arms around my shoulders and sit me up. The baby eventually calmed down. My husband put the hospital bed into a sitting position, and we just sat there in shock and did not fall asleep for the rest of the night. Till this day, I still have no idea how, what, and why it happened, because this was the first time I experienced something like that. So the moral of the story is that it's always a great idea to have someone staying with you overnight at the hospital if possible, because really, you never know what could happen. The last day at the hospital, My husband and I were so overwhelmed by everything that had transpired that we just looked at each other and wept. We couldn't stop crying for like 10 minutes. Over the past 72 hours, from almost losing our baby the first night at the hospital to me almost choking to death the night before, it was truly an insanely crazy, amazing, and overwhelming experience. At this time, I'd like to encourage all of my listeners to leave a review of this episode and our podcast on iTunes/Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Podcast, Stitcher, Amazon Music, Pandora, iHeartRadio, TuneIn plus Alexa, or wherever you are listening to your podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please leave a review or comment about your pregnancy stories, because you might even hear your reviews and or your stories on the air. So please join us.